Aldous Huxley was an English writer and philosopher. He wrote nearly 50 books. And here's his quote about history. That men do not learn very much from the lessons of history is the most important of all the lessons of history. Welcome to the History Slices podcast, a mother-son duo discussing awesome bits of history. We prove on every show that history is not boring, entertaining, yet stimulating. This is History Slices. And now, here's your hosts, Jacob and Rachel.
Well, hey, Jay.
Hey, Mom.
How's it going?
It's going good. How's it going with you?
It's going well, as always. It's a beautiful day
wonderful.
Today.
It is. Yeah, I was out there earlier.
Yeah, it's finally starting to warm up. That's exciting. I'm excited for this week's topic.
Do you remember what
I remember.
it is?
It's about folklore. It was a little bit vague, your teaser last time.
It was, yeah. Well, I was still in the process of developing it, so hopefully what I have presented today will be interesting. I certainly think it is. Basically, this is a little bit of a departure from what we usually talk about, but I thought this is a really interesting, like, kind of side nugget to talk about. It goes without saying, a lot of this is very much this surface level stuff. If you're really interested in it, look it up. I guarantee it's really interesting.
There's so much out there. Right. I know when I was a young girl, I used to love going to that section of the library that had all the folklore, and especially was fond of like the Alaskan folklore stories.
Oh,
really,
yeah.
Very fascinating. I love that kind of stuff.
That is interesting. You're talking about that because Inuit kind of style folklore is very much like how to survive in a harsh environment. It's not so much like right or wrong, I guess, technically. You know, like a lot of later belief systems, I guess, if you want to call them that, they're kind of more like justice and, you know, like how to conduct yourself every day. And in a lot of more, I guess, earlier civilizations, if that's the right way to say it, it's more about like, well, here's how to not die first of all, and not starve and freeze.
Yeah, that's really cool too to see like what the themes were, what the popular themes and the tone of them were.
Sure.
So yeah, I'm excited to hear what you have to say today.
Sure. So I've chosen 4 subjects, or 4 topics, I should say. Subjects is a wrong connotation. I've chosen 4 topics to talk about today involving folklore. The first one is the fair folk. Do you know what that is?
All right, like fairies?
Yeah, like fairies. Yeah. The reason why they're called the fair folk is also called the gentle folk sometimes, or gentle whatever. You don't want to tick them off. There's a sign of respect. They're found mainly in European, especially British folklore. And unlike what Disney will have you think, they run the gambit of sizes. Sometimes they're like real small, like like Tinkerbell or whatever. And other times they're around the size of a person.
That's interesting.
Also, on the original folklore, they didn't have wings, or at least that wasn't as common. Now it's more of a Victorian artwork thing because there's a big boom in interest in fairies around that time.
Oh, wow.
So first of all, you should know that the word fairy, it can mean several different things. It's a bit broad, it's a bit vague, and it often is applied to a number of fantastical, weird stuff, and isn't necessarily like what we hear the word fairy, you think of Tinkerbell, and it doesn't always mean that in stories, which make it difficult to research. So we're just going to go in with the more popular definition. Stories of fairies have been around for like ever, but during the Victorian and Edwardian eras, like I mentioned before, there was a big boom in stories about fairies, artwork about fairies. There's a very famous hoax where these girls cut out pictures of a magazine or whatever and basically made it look like they had images of them with fairies.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Like this is back when photography was still very early on. And a lot of people were convinced at the time, but then they later admitted like, no, we made it up. It's not. Yeah. And there's a lot of different ideas about like where these stories come from. What are they, And there's an idea of among people who believe that they exist, which obviously isn't everyone. It's one of those like regional things. Like in Ireland, belief in the fair folk is a lot of people buy into that. Well, in like America, not so much, it's a different culture, but the idea is they might be demoted angels, which is not a fallen angel. A demoted angel, I don't know if this makes sense, but the idea is that when the war in heaven happened, and God cast out the bad apples, the ones in heaven stayed angels, the ones in hell became demons, and the ones on earth got stuck on earth.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's one theory or one idea.
I'd never heard that before.
Yeah, there's also the idea that it might be like pagan deities, like what the pagans worshipped, demons, ghosts, whatever. Back in the day, there was a thought that they were a previously prehistoric unknown race of people, which obviously is a little suspect, but it's interesting what they think of.
Yeah.
So what a fairy is basically a magical person. The short and skinny of it is, and where they are in terms of morality or in terms of presence varies drastically depending on the story. And they often have a very alien sense of thinking and a very alien sense of like right and wrong. Like they have.
Now, when you say alien, you mean from outside, or you don't mean like
I don't mean space alien.
Extraterrestrial.
No,
alien.
I mean like in terms of very
foreign.
Yeah, different from how people, how humans think and see things. I understand the confusion. They often have a lot of like crazy complex rules. And if you break them and you don't often realize you're breaking them because they're crazy and complex and it's never explained, then terrible things happen to you.
Oh.
And there's a lot of stories in playing pranks, both like kind of harmless and harmful pranks, like, tying up like a girl's hair up when she's asleep or whatever, stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, like the tooth fairy also is it's not a prank, but it's interesting. I never thought about a tooth fairy in the sense of like the fairies that you're describing now. I never really thought of it like that.
I don't know the origins of the tooth fairy. I didn't think to look it up, but yeah, they're honestly folklore fairies, not Disney childhood fairies. Folklore fairies are terrifying to me. Like there's these themes called fairy circles, which is like a circle on the ground and fairies would dance in it. And if you happen to enter one, it wouldn't be good. Like either you dance forever or you come out and centuries had passed in like the rest of the world, kind of like Rip Van Winkle.
Yeah.
While you just same thing with like don't eat fairy food or drink their mead or whatever, because terrible things happen.
Isn't that interesting? That's reminds me a little bit of the Outlander book series, and it's now a series.
I know you've been watching that.
Yeah, but it has to do with not so much the fairies, but the standing stones and in a circle and being like a portal or passageway to a different time. So, but I've heard of fairy circles before too.
Yeah, they I don't know what it is. It might just be because it's a geometric shape or whatever, but circles feature a lot in kind of legends and folklore and stuff like that. There's this one area, I can't remember where it is. I want to say it's on like the East Coast somewhere. I'm just thinking of it now, or remembering it now, I should say. There's this area called like the Devil's Circle, and it's basically this patch of ground that is nothing grows in it, and it's just a complete circle. And it's like in the middle of like the forest or whatever. So there's plant life all over the place except this one area for whatever reason. Don't know why. I'm sure some natural explanation. But local superstition has it that that's where the devil would go and like hang out is in that circle.
Wow. Kind of makes you want to stay away. Even if it's not true. It's like just in case.
Yeah. Well, there's so many places like that throughout like the whole world that like, oh, this area is haunted or this area, the goat man lives here. It's I want to, before we move on, I want to talk briefly about changelings.
Changelings.
Yeah. Do you know what that is?
Yes. Let me guess, or let me see if I remember.
Okay.
First of all, it makes me think of A Wrinkle in Time for some reason. I don't know if there's a changeling in that book or if that author...
There's a shapeshifter. I don't know if it's not the same thing, though.
If that author wrote another book called The Changeling or something. But
he wrote
is a changeling where like a baby is born and then either dies right away or something happened to having to do with the baby and they change into... like the fairies come and take them or something to that effect.
Yeah, basically. The idea is that a fairy, sometimes it's a goblin or a troll, the story, it changes depending on where it's being told and who tells it. Like Scandinavia, trolls are more popular, I think, but that's just my vague understanding of that. Yeah. They'll steal a newborn baby and replace it with their own baby.
Oh.
And back in the day, this was used to explain birth defects or disorders or whatever, both physical stuff and mental stuff, because they didn't know what was up with that.
How sad to have a baby that might have some defects and then think it's a troll baby.
Yeah, I know, right?
Or a fairy baby, or it really isn't your baby. That's
the stories usually end up with the magic kid, whoever, because they're very strange and they're very different than everyone else. They usually disappear back into the forest or wherever, because they don't really belong with humans.
Right.
There's actually was a recent horror movie that had this premise. I didn't see it because I'm not really into horror movies that much. Sometimes it depends on what it's about. But I thought that's an interesting idea for a horror movie, and it kind of fits, I thought,
Yeah, I can see how that would be scary.
Yeah, so in terms of defending yourself against the Fae, which is another name for them, fair folk, whatever, fairies, you have these nightmare beings. You have cold iron. That's like a lot of stories talk about how cold iron specifically is like deadly to them or whatever, or at least is a great repellent for them.
Wow.
I don't know why.
Yeah.
I'm not sure
like what form,
from.
like a pipe or a pan or a...
I don't know. It's just general, I
Okay.
guess. It's kind of like a typical weakness they say. They also, in a lot of stories, again, this depends on like which story you're
There's
looking
a lot of
at.
variation.
Yeah. They can't tell lies, though oftentimes they will lie by omission or by twisting truths or whatever, but they can't outright tell a falsehood. And they're very prideful, sort of the stories go.
Yeah.
So like there are ways to kind of like, if you're clever enough and you know what you're dealing with, you can kind of work your way out of it, but most people don't.
Yeah. Oh, that's really, really fascinating.
Yeah. So this was an interesting thing. I thought, okay, well, we can start
So
with
in
that.
general, it's better just to not come across a fairy or one of those beings because they'll probably win.
Yeah. And they're
interaction.
not nice, at least not by our standards.
Yeah.
Maybe by their standards, but not by ours. So the next thing I want to talk about, and this is a much more American thing, because that was a very European thing we're talking about. Fearsome Creatures. Basically, when Europeans started to colonize the New World and America became a thing, like the country, obviously, and they, started to expand out west and stuff, there was a lot of kind of tall tales and a lot of, I don't know what you call it, like legends about various creatures and various strange looking animals and stuff. Like, you know the story of Paul Bunyan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
His big blue ox.
Yeah.
babe.
There's been some, I don't know if disgusting is the right word, but there's been some thought among people who know about this and study this stuff that might count as a fearsome critter, just because it's like a very strange animal that shows up in these stories. These things are basically unknown outside of America, and even in America, they're kind of obscure.
Yeah.
Just nowadays.
Yeah, you mean the fearsome critters?
Yeah.
Yeah. And in that particular instance too, Paul Bunyan himself was like an enormous person.
Yeah, like for our non-American listeners who don't know who Paul Bunyan is, the story goes that he's basically like this giant
He's like a lumberjack too.
Yeah, lumberjack.
Yeah.
And the story goes that one day he was walking and his axe was being dragged along the ground behind him, and that created the Grand Canyon. To give an idea of how crazy that is. It's like it's just an American kind of like tall tale, I guess.
Yeah.
But I want to talk a bit about some of these critters because they're pretty interesting and unique.
Yeah.
And of course, kind of related to like the fairies, a lot of what they actually look like changes based on the story. It's more of what they do that's like a consistent thing. So the first one is the side hill gouger. And there's actually a couple names for this thing, most of which I can't pronounce. So whatever. Basically, sometimes it's described as like an alligator looking thing with armadillo's armor. Other times it's a deer with rabbit ears. Like the look drastically changes. What is consistent though is that it's a predator with uneven legs. 2 of its legs are longer than the other 2, so it's often found on hills and stuff. It can get around on mountain slopes. However, it's impossible to chase people on level ground. The design flaw there, but that's like how you get away from it. Is you gotta get the heck off that uneven ground and onto like flat land.
Oh, that's really fascinating. That makes me think of like mountain goats and things like that.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
So the other one, there's another one called a hodag.
Never heard of it.
Yeah,
Sounds like something you're trying to say backwards.
Yeah, currently it's the mascot for the Rhinelander High School in Wisconsin, which I think is funny.
Oh, that's...
It's a mismatch of animals. Specifically, it's described as having a frog's head, an elephant's face with large claws, and a dinosaur's back, which I'm not sure what that means. But
what a strange thing to have as a mascot.
I know. So that's fun. I just thought that was like a fun thing. And of course, a lot of these guys when they're not mischievous or goofy, they're like, oh, watch out, gonna get ya, you know. Squonk, which is like a fun one. It's a really sad animal. It allegedly lives in Pennsylvania and is super ugly. It has a lot of warts and blisters and like hives. And it's just like this ugly looking thing. So it lives all day underground where no one can see it because it's so ashamed of how ugly it is. Oh. And at night, it spends all night crying over like, oh, I'm so hideous. Oh. It's a real terrible story, but I thought it was funny. Like bored frontiersmen coming up with like these ideas.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really crazy. That makes me think of cats. Like if you ever... I just remember like as a kid, because I had cats or a cat, and I'd hear it outside at night sometimes just crying and kind of making a lot of noise, you know, out there. And I wonder if, you know, it just makes you wonder what the impetus is for some of these tales. What started it could have just been cats out there arguing or something. Yeah.
Also, I should say that like as far as I know, no one believes in these critters. Some of the stuff we're going to talk about today, people still believe in, and I want to kind of address that when we get to it. But right now, this is purely fictional. Yeah. As far as
and
most
people
know
are
that
it's fictional.
Yeah. Most people don't know about them is the thing. The most famous one is probably the jackalope,
right?
Which is like a vicious killer rabbit with antlers, like a deer antlers. You see fake taxidermy of them like all over the Southwest because it's like a fun joke that people have. President Reagan at one point claimed to caught one, but that was probably a joke. I'm going to give him benefit of doubt and say that was a joke. Also, there is a medical condition that rabbits have, which like really makes their incisors grow really large, and it's really unhealthy because they end up like starving because they can't.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, but some people think that maybe that might have been where this idea could have possibly came from. Also, rabbits will often have their ears straight up when they're going, which has fooled me a couple times because we just see in the night when someone runs across, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, no, that's fine.
Oh no, okay.
No. This one has a long name, so I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Aversboro gilliniper.
Wow.
Yeah, a lot of them have really goofy names like this. This is basically a hawk-sized mosquito that lives in North Carolina. It can
sounds terrible.
Drain a man in one bite.
Oh my gosh.
I thought it was pretty badass, so I included it on the list. But yeah, that's like
a hawk-sized mosquito.
That's like some like H.R. Geiger levels of nightmares.
Yeah, right that really is. That's super scary. I've seen some big mosquitoes before in Alaska, but not quite that big.
Fur-bearing trout, which is what it sounds like.
Goodness.
That's another popular taxidermy joke.
Oh, that's so funny.
Where people will just put fur on a trout. You know,
that's a funny one.
Yeah.
What does that trout do? Do you know? Like,
I don't know. I think it's just a fish with fur.
Yeah.
You know, it's just kind of one of those like weird things.
Yeah.
The hide behind, and this is my favorite one. It's a creature so good at hiding behind things or people, as the case might be. No one has ever seen it. It could be behind you right now, listener. You would never know. Unless you're like staying up against like a wall or something. But yeah.
I never heard of that either.
Really?
Like, yeah, I wonder.
I've known about this for like years.
Well, I wonder if it's something that parents would use to say, you know, you better be good or the hide behind is going to, you know what you're doing or something.
Maybe, yeah. There's another one here that I'm remembering now. I didn't put down, unfortunately, but basically there's this type of bird that has backwards feet so that hunters, when they're following the footprints, will end up going to where it's gone and not where it is.
I love that one.
Yeah, so it's just kind of clever.
Just flipping the feet around.
Yeah. This is a clever
That's hilarious.
one. Yeah. So there's tons more. There's a whole bunch of them. And if you're curious, look them up. They're a blast. But I just do them because they're fun. They're freaky. Sometimes, they're just, I don't know. I just think it's fun.
They're pretty out there.
They're pretty out there. Yeah. And I wish that more people know about them, honestly.
So they can come up in conversation every now and then.
So I have a use for this useless knowledge I have. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about are old wives' tales. And I'm not sure how widespread the term is, so I'll define it real quickly. An old wives' tale is a superstition or an urban legend or whatever that is passed down from, at least back in the day, was passed down from an older woman to a younger woman, kind of a generational thing. Mm-hmm. I think that term's a little outdated now just because gender roles aren't as, I guess, defined now as it was then.
Yeah.
But
that's interesting though, because it signifies something. Old wives' tale means a certain thing. So aside from any evolution of the word wife or whatever, modern, it's still old wives' tale is still like an old wives' tale
term. Yeah. But I think a lot of these claims are pretty funny or interesting. I kind of want to read off a couple of them. First of all these are not true, by the way. Wearing eyeglasses unnecessarily can damage your eyes. Your eyes were probably damaged to begin with if you need eyeglasses. Cracking knuckles gives arthritis. Speaking from personal experience as well as general medical consensus, that's not true. There's a fact, one guy, I don't remember his name, he spent like decades cracking the knuckles on like one hand, not the other, just to test it out. Just to test it out, and he was fine. There wasn't
that's determination.
Yeah, but he got like a medical prize or something for it.
Wow.
Because he's like, see, it doesn't. Chocolate leads to acne. We both know that's not true. Making silly faces makes said face stuck like that. It's probably more just to keep kids from being goofy, honestly. Letting a wound dry out is a proper way to heal it. That's just dangerous. Masturbation leads to blindness and hairy palms. That's a famous one. I get the blind thing. That's a pretty terrible fate, but what's so bad with hairy palms? I don't know. I don't get that. Regardless.
Jacob, that's hilarious, though. Because you'd look like the werewolf man or something.
Exactly. Well, regardless,
can you imagine?
That's not true.
Ew.
Having high heart rates while pregnant leads to female children. That's not how that works. Having your toes pointed up signifies low blood sugar. Also,
your toes pointed up?
Yeah. Also not how that works. Swallowed gum stays in your stomach for several years. It doesn't. I mean, you probably shouldn't swallow gum regardless, but it doesn't. One has to wait an hour to swim after eating, maybe for some people, but generally no.
It's interesting that all of these have to do so far with, your body.
Well, a lot of it was like about pregnancy or about like women stuff, health stuff. Yeah.
Right.
Having white spots on your fingernails due to lying or not eating vegetables. In reality, it's you got an injury at the base of your nail, and that's what causes that. And it's usually just got like bent or hit in a way. But no, it obviously it doesn't. Lying doesn't have any physical thing. Eating crust on sandwiches or eating crust of sandwiches makes your hair go curly. I don't know. I usually don't eat crust, so I can't really judge that one.
I heard that it puts hair on your chest too.
All right.
Yeah.
It's possible to swallow your own tongue. Not you can suffocate from your tongue, but unless it's cut off, you can't swallow it. Saving makes your hair grow back thicker. This one might actually be true. I don't know. Every time I save, it feels like it goes. It gets thicker, but I don't know. So yeah, there's just like some fun, like kind of goofy the stuff that I've heard about. Can I give you
two more?
Yeah, of course.
I heard from my mom.
Sure.
That I don't know if this was her own little tale just to mess with me.
Sure.
Or if it's something that's more common. But she said that if you sleep with your mouth open and a fly flies by your mouth, your face would be stuck like that. So another one of those kind of silly faces things. So I used to sleep with my covers over my mouth because I was afraid of that. And another thing
I was always worried about sleeping with my mouth open because I'd fear a spider would crawl inside.
Another thing she told me, and these are like I remember being around the age of 5 or so and believing these things.
Of course. Because before a certain age, everything your parents say is gospel. You just take it at face value.
Yeah.
And then like once you reach a certain age, and it's different for different kids, there comes a day where you're like, that's kind of ridiculous. So
the other thing she told me was that she had eyes in the back of her head. And so she could always see what was happening. And I literally thought that if I, moved her hair around, I would be able to see a pair of eyes back there in the back of her head. But yeah, those are...
You think the hair would get in the way of her vision?
Yeah, you would think that.
I guess as a kid, you don't think about that stuff.
I was like, she could uncover, cover as needed.
Yeah. So yeah, those are funny. Thanks for sharing them. I just wanted to kind of, because some of these I've heard about, with the gum.
I've heard almost all those too. Yeah, very common.
Yeah, stuff. And I thought these are funny. They're goofy. Most of them are pretty harmless. Obviously, if you're bleeding, don't bleed out.
Yeah.
But it's I just thought it was a fun kind of tall tale stuff. The last thing we're going to cover is Tales of the East. And by East, I mean Japan. Obviously, there's a lot of different cultures there, and I don't want to say it's all Japanese because that's not true. But specifically, I want to talk about kami, I think it's how it's pronounced. And we'll get to that in a moment. I want to just quickly address a side thing. Due to how I researched this and the specific kind of weed patches I got lost in while doing so, this section's a little different. It's more about a religion / mythology than folk tale, though there's some overlap there, just because of how Shintoism works. I thought it was interesting to talk about anyway. Anyways, kami. What's a kami? A kami is a Shinto concept. They're basically spirits or deities, as the case might be. At least that's how we would understand them. And they represent a lot of different stuff. Like usually it's nature, like trees, lakes, rocks, whatever. But a lot of times it's also dead people. Sometimes it's like households or like unanimate objects, like shrines or pots or whatever. They're all over the place, and there's a lot. They can be good or bad, and there are apparently like 300 different types.
Wow.
Not individuals, types.
Wow.
So
they're everywhere.
Yeah, they're everywhere. In according to Shintoism, which obviously is still a belief still held in Japan. And I don't want, by including on this list alongside squonks and other crazy made up stuff, I don't want to imply that I hold that lesser or that I'm disrespectful towards it. I just think it's a very interesting thing that I am in particular very ignorant about, even after doing all this research about it. So yeah, just so there's no confusion. And if I get anything wrong, I'm sorry. I'm an ignorant white American. Sorry. Please don't be mad. Anywho, and there's a lot of festivities and ceremonies that are held being respectful or celebrating these they're kind of like the fair folk. If you want to be respectful to them, or else something bad will happen. Like, oh, your crops are ruined or whatever, stuff like that. And of course, there's also a lot of different conflicting stories about them. If I ever cover this topic again in some fashion, in some way, I'll probably talk a little bit more about different stories. But what I do have for you is I have some very famous kami, which these ones are basically more like deities than spirits. But
okay.
I thought they were really interesting.
Would you mind spelling that word for me?
Kami.
Okay.
Yeah, I know. It's one of those things where Mandarin has the same thing, probably because there's a lot of overlap between those two languages, where when you translate the letters into English letters, the pronunciations are sometimes different. Like Lao Tzu, who is a Chinese philosopher from like centuries ago, like a long time ago, his name is spelt like Lao Tzu or whatever, it's not, there's a T in there which isn't pronounced when you say the name. It's fine, that's just how it is. But what that leads to me is I mispronounce all this stuff. So I'm not like being purposely ignorant. I'm just it's dumb.
Always tricky.
It's always tricky. Yeah. So Amaterasu, I guess, she's the sun goddess. Shows up a lot in like video games nowadays, and kind of popular culture, at least popular culture coming out of Japan. Her shrine is in Ise. I don't know how you pronounce that. It's a city, and that's a major like pilgrimage site, major tourist site. Wow. A lot of people come and like look at it or pay respects or whatever. And a lot of depictions I found of her have her as this beautiful woman. So that's cool. So she's just like a less jerk Zeus kind of.
That's really interesting. And it makes me think of, wasn't Ra the sun goddess in the Egyptian?
He was a god, but yeah.
Sun god. Oh, yeah. Ra, that's right. He was a god.
Yeah, but yeah, no, in Egyptian mythology, Ra carried the sun every day on his chariot.
Yeah.
And that's how it,
Right. It's interesting that so many cultures have a sun god or goddess.
I mean, it makes sense. It's this giant ball of fire in the sky.
Yeah, it does make sense. It kind of gets your attention.
Yeah. Fujin, who's the god of the wind, which is an interesting thing to be a god of. I thought like specifically just wind. He looks kind of like this wizard ogre looking person. He's brothers with Radzin, who's the god of thunder and lightning, as well as storms.
Do they all have shrines?
I believe so, or most of them do. There's a lot of predictions of Radzin with drums, like thunder, like
right, that makes
and
sense.
He looks all crazy, wild haired and whatnot, because he's storms, that makes sense. And both brothers are often like sewn together, like in paintings or carvings or what have you. And there's a story about how Radzin defended Japan from invading Mongols by sending storms. Now, in real life history, the Mongols did try to invade Japan twice, and both times got their fleets destroyed by storms. Ward is still out on divine intervention, but who knows? It is one of those like kind of crazy coincidences of history
that you might want to attribute to something.
Yeah. Especially if you believe in that type of stuff and that's part of your belief system, and then suddenly your home is saved from these invaders by a natural force twice. I mean, I'd probably buy that, sir. Hataman. This one represents kind of archery and warfare, and this was one of the ones that got greatly influenced by Buddhism when it spread to Japan. Because what happened was Buddhism originated in like India and it kind of spread across East Asia. And eventually, I can't remember if it was an emperor or just a scholar or whoever, philosopher, whoever, someone brought it to Japan and it kind of became Shinto Buddhism, which is like a kind of merge, of the two beliefs. That changed a few things about this guy. A lot of the stuff I was reading about right over my head. I'm like, okay, it's like referencing things that I don't have context for. So right. I don't know too much about that, but it's interesting. Yeah. Zangi and Zanmi? I'm not sure how to, I think this is one of those cases where the English is pronounced different, or the letters are pronounced differently. Whatever. This couple made the Japanese archipelago. And came before a lot of the other ones. So they're basically like the creator deities in Shintoism. Yeah. And of course, there's a lot more. And those are like just like the deities, there's individual like kind of spirits and stuff of like this particular tree or whatever. In the films of the Miyazaki, who's like a really famous animator. He made like My Neighbor Totoro and Howl's Moving Castle and Spirited Away. A lot of very famous animated films, but he invented for his films a new type of kami, which is basically these soot sprites, and they're just like little balls of soot that like go around and stuff. They're very cute. And they showed up in like 2 of his films are otherwise completely unconnected. So it's just like, it's just a fun thing. They show up a lot in like Japanese pop culture. Like there's some Pokemon based off them alongside being based off like animals. And
he just created them. He just made them up.
Just made up those ones. Yeah. But like there's also, kami in general, not the soot guys. They show up a lot in like video games, a lot in like the Persona series, just a bunch of kind of stories that come out of Japan still has like a lot of that influence. Yeah. And
that as an outsider, we wouldn't recognize it necessarily.
No, we would have a different kind of concept of that stuff. And there's even been like, because Japan, I don't know if you know this about Japan, they love monsters. They love mermaids. They love vampires, werewolves, aliens. Like they love monster stuff. Like that pops up a lot. And like even if it's like from like a European or American origin, Japan eats that stuff up. I don't know why. That's just what they're into, I guess. But the Flatwoods monster, which is a cryptid thing from America, like back in the 50s, it was an owl. I'm just going to spoil it. It was an owl, probably. But people thought they saw this crazy looking alien in the woods. This was an American thing. I want to say East Coast, whatever. Japan got wind of it, probably because it's like among monster things. That's like it's a very distinctive look. And it's shown up sometimes in a couple of their video games and their stories as a kami.
Wow.
So stuff like that. Like they'll just kind of like, oh, it's probably this thing, because that's kind of their culture. So they adopt it
and pull it in. Yeah. Very interesting.
So all this stuff is just really fascinating to me. It's not really history, but I thought that it was a fun little detour while we're talking about history.
Yeah, and in a sense, it touches history because it's something that's been around a long time. A lot of times, stories probably just passed orally, like before they were even written down anywhere. They just get handed down from one generation to the next. And
absolutely. And like I think history and culture kind of goes hand in hand, for better, for worse, and belief, whether or not you personally subscribe to it or not, is a massive part of culture, like having belief systems and stuff, and there's some overlap and there's some drastic different stuff. What the Aztecs believed was very different than what the Europeans at the time believed. That was different from what their neighbors believed.
It just creates a whole different context for understanding life and the world. Jacob, I was really looking forward to this episode on folklore because it's just something I think is really fascinating. I love that you pulled in something from the East, because I personally am not very familiar with, stuff that comes from Eastern cultures. So that was really interesting. Thank you for doing that. I know there's a lot more out there.
Of course.
In the way
I didn't even touch Africa.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And that's got to be really rich. You think with a really oral historical tradition, passing down stories. So yeah, you covered kind of a lot of ground in a short period of time. So that's cool. Kind of cracked the nut for us to go dig in a little bit more. So that's cool. Thank you so much for bringing that to us.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I hope our audience enjoyed it.
And so next time, what are we going to look forward to?
Well, next time we're going to look at another event. This one's a bit of a interesting kind of mystery, if you will. Have you ever heard of Flight 19?
I feel like that sounds familiar to me, but I don't know why.
Right. Well, I'll just tease it for next time. It is arguably the most famous disappearance in the Bermuda Triangle.
Oh, very mysterious.
Yeah, so we'll be talking all about that next week.
Yeah, cool.
So be sure to tune in.
Right on. Flight 19 up next. And This has been a great episode about folklore. Thank you so much, audience. Thanks for being there.
Bye.
Confucius once said, "Study the past if you would define the future." You've been listening to the History Slices podcast with Jacob and Rachel. We hope you've gotten some useful information from the show. We hope we made you think, and we hope you were entertained. We know we had fun, and we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hook up with us on Facebook at History Slices and on Instagram at History Slices Podcast. Make sure to like, rate, and review the show, and tell a friend about the show. That'll help us out too. One more quote before we go from Michael Crichton. If you don't know history, then you don't know anything. You are a leaf that doesn't know it's part of a tree. Till next time, this is History Slices, signing off.